And that kind of brings me to another point I had on here. How much testing is too much testing? Or is there such a thing?
Well, there's a cost to writing tests, of course. But what's your opinion on that?
Um, well, I don't think there is such a thing as too much testing. And here's why. The way I run my testing workflow is very fast, and I'm set up where I could show that a little later if we want to take a look at it. But I can run a specific test and jump to the code and then run the test and then jump to the code and then run the test really, really fast. And I very rarely will run my entire test suite locally. That's what CI/CDs are for. So I'll run the test area locally, make sure I haven't screwed it up, but then send it off to the CI/CD and let it spend 20 or 30 minutes running the 2,500 test suite, right? Go get a cup of coffee, break for lunch, let it do its thing. That's what it's there for. So I don't generally think that there is such a thing as too much testing. There are things that aren't worth testing, like I said before, but I wouldn't say, oh, you're doing too many tests.
Well, here's something that I've been thinking about, and I don't know if we'll get into this later, but like part of me looks at like the Rails testing, and I think part of it is, I hate to say, I don't know if it's a mess, if that's the right term, but the fact that, and what I'm getting at is that when you look at the Rails testing webpage, they talk about tests for models and tests for helpers and tests for controllers and tests for views and tests, like all these different tests. And to me, you're potentially, well, I'll ask as a question, are you testing too much if you have helper tests and model tests and controller tests and view tests, and particularly if they're potentially redundant?
Well, yeah.
Could you get by with just essentially unit tests and integration tests, for example?
For the most part, I would say yes. I don't think you should redundantly test things and say, oh, well, they've got an area for controller tests, I should test all my controllers. They've got an area for model tests, I should test all my models. I don't think that at all. So redundancy is obviously something you want to get out of there as much as you can. There are some times when, I want to have in the unit test, I want to test something, and in the feature test, I want to test the same thing because I can't really pull it out of one or the other, and the unit tests will run faster, so I can do quick hit tests with the unit tests and then let my CI/CD run my feature stuff. Because it's going to run all the JavaScript and headless browsers and all that mess, and it takes forever. But and that's another thing that kind of comes with experience, is knowing which parts to test and not. For instance, I never write controller tests unless I'm testing a public API that I'm developing. Otherwise, I never write controller tests because I have never found them to be useful and non-redundant with anything else. I typically will test the models, any classes I've got, and then feature tests.
Yeah, what I have been doing is I use column feature tests, integration tests, basically are the full stack tests.
Right.
So, this is like headless browser stuff. And so I basically program or develop tests for the happy path of testing all the features. So for example, if you have a form builder application, well, can a user create a form, publish it, and someone can then go in and submit information through that form? That test, the integration or the feature test to make sure that happy path works good. And then I'll call them unit tests, basically to test each variation of where it's needed. So for example, testing that these values are valid, these are not. So, and I'm starting to get into, or I'm starting to do this more where I'm using skeletal, like there was this term in the Ruby on Rails world talking about, was it fat model skinny controllers or whatever?
Mm-hmm.
So basically saying try to make your controller smaller. Well, what I've been doing, and I think some of this is talking about poros or plain old Ruby objects, the acronym for it,
Right.
is developing my own objects or my own classes for almost every interaction other than the base Rails stuff. So basically, the controller, like it calls a pure Ruby object to do everything that I would want to do in a controller. And even in the model, a lot of methods that would be in the model are moved to these separate Ruby objects. So basically, it's kind of a skinny controller, skinny model. So
Right.
it's basically, and I'm trusting, and if you do this, the benefit of it is that if you trust like your framework knows how to handle models and it essentially you shouldn't have to test too much of that because the model, the interactions between models when you set up that this belongs to this model or this has many of this model, you shouldn't have to test necessarily that from a model perspective because it's kind of in there.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe your feature tests should warn you if something big like that breaks. But basically, when you need all your custom code where it's not relatively simple, you use Ruby objects for that. And those you test out the wazoo with, the public interfaces of those objects.
Right.
So that's the kind of where I've kind of been moving to in terms of my testing, in terms of how I do it. So I don't have like tons of separate model tests and controller tests and, things of that nature.
Right. And I think, see, the way I do it is pretty much because the user interface is the interface to your product and what has to be shown to the public, I spend most of my time in the feature tests, the integration tests, to see if the user does this, I expect this to happen. And here's how the user is going to use it or break it. But what I use unit tests for typically is when I'm actually developing a class.
Right.
Because they are much faster. It makes a much faster test cycle doing unit tests than feature tests. So I like to have the feature tests so I can test, here's what the front end is. But when I'm actually developing, most of the time I'll do unit tests. Okay, I got to develop this class that does this. Okay, it's got to do this, 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 this. All right, now let's write the test or the code to make the test pass. And that's a really fast cycle. And this kind of gets back to what you were saying before, kind of gets back to one of the reasons that I don't ever use controller tests is because if you're doing things right, in my opinion, your controllers shouldn't need much testing. They shouldn't be doing hardly anything.
Right. And it's actually a sign because it is really hard to test controllers efficiently and to test. If you have a lot of code in your controllers, it's really hard to test. But if you take all of that logic you're trying to do in a controller, put it in its own method, then it's very fast to do it.
Right.
To test all sorts of variations of it should break here, it should, not break here,
right.
etc.
And the only time that I could justify writing controller tests is for an API where that is the public interface. So you have to make sure now, and even when I'm writing those, I'm not testing, oh, it gets this this JSON and all this stuff. I'm just testing the request response to make sure my
response, right.
endpoints are correct.
Yeah.
The class test, the unit test comes out properly.
Yep.
So
if you like this clip and want to watch another one, you can click right here. Or if you want to watch the full video, you can click here.